Hello, my name is Santo Alioto, and I'm on the corner of Ness and Vallejo, where about 60 years ago, a little more than 60 years ago, I sold newspapers. I'm 74 years old, and I sold newspapers. I first started when I was 10. I sold my first newspapers on the corner of Hyde and Union, where the Swenson's ice cream store is. That's when Earl was still owner, and so I remember working there, and the first night I made $1.42, and that was pretty good money back then. And then eventually they got me a corner right down here on Ness and Vallejo, and I worked that corner 5 days a week. I used to make about $1.67. It was mainly traffic from the cars. The cars would come by, you'd be holding up the headlines, and you had regular customers, and they'd stop, you'd open up the door with your left, you'd throw the paper in and reach out, they would give you 7 cents. The newspaper was 7 cents, and if they gave you a dime, then you were really lucky that night that you got 3 cents more in a newspaper. The newspapers at the time, there were 4 newspapers in San Francisco. The morning newspapers were the Chronicle and the Examiner, and they were mostly home delivery. They sold some down in the financial district. The newspapers that sold in the evening were the San Francisco Call Bulletin and the San Francisco News. The News was owned by the Scripps Howard family, and the Call Bulletin was independently owned. The Call Bulletin sold more papers than the News, and they would have different editions. And one afternoon, you'd come to work, I'd get here about 3:45, and they would have the home edition of the Call Bulletin. Then they'd come by and give you the 7-Star Sport, which was for all the horse racing junkies. And then the last paper came out at around 4:45, which was called the 9-Star Final. And people would go, and the News, by the way, had 3 editions also. They called it the D2 Star, D3 Star, and D4 Star, which was the latest edition during that day. In those days, there wasn't as much television or radio. Well, a lot of people didn't have TVs. There wasn't as much radio news. So people would take the paper in the afternoon, they'd go home and read the paper in the early evening or after dinner. And people were devoted to the newspaper. They had a lot of good columnists, local and national. People were devoted to the Call Bulletin. If you ran out of Call Bulletins, many times they would say, well, I'll come back later, or I'll buy it at another corner. Or they reluctantly would buy the News. Eventually, with the advent of television news, local and nationally, newspapers started to fade. The afternoon newspapers started to fade, and they merged into one newspaper. The afternoon newspapers became the News Call Bulletin. By that time, I was in the late 50s, early 60s. I was 18, 19 years old, and I got a job once again with the News Call Bulletin downtown in their subscriber and complaint division. And I was a member of the American Newspaper Guild, and I worked late afternoons listening to all the complaints, and I usually worked till about 9 o'clock. I was a student at San Francisco State, and I worked my way through college and eventually graduated from San Francisco State. Today I live out in the suburbs. I'm a retired school teacher, as is my wife, and just reminiscing makes me feel good to talk about old Ness and Vallejo.